Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Betwixt the Books. Today we will be talking about Heart Haunt Havoc by Frady Moon. I believe that's how you pronounce their name. If I am mispronouncing it, I'm so sorry, but I could not for the life of me, and I did figure out anywhere where I could find a video of them saying it themselves. And maybe I just missed it. Feel free to correct me, because I would like to pronounce it correctly, but I believe it's Frady with the accent, Frady. This is the second book of theirs that I have read, but the first time that Gretchen is reading them, and it is a novella-length horror romance, if that makes any sense.
So Michaela originally pitched this book to me, and she was like, hey, so romance in a haunted house? And I was like, I need to understand the logistics of how that would even work, so yes. For a novella, there is a lot going on in this, so I'm just going to try to do the best recap I can. So the story starts with our, technically the best word to describe him to you would be exorcist, but he's very, very specific that he has left the employ of the Vatican and is now basically just considered a specialist. But for the purposes of action, an exorcist, Colin, who has been called to this aforementioned haunted house by a person named Bishop who uses they them pronouns, and Bishop is like, hey, my house is haunted, can you help? And Colin steps over the threshold and he goes, oh my god, pun intended. There is definitely something very not right in this house, and it becomes clearer and clearer to Colin that Bishop is not telling him everything there is to know, and things are gonna get really, really, really dangerous, and also, they're gonna have feelings.
I think you'll see as we go into discussing this that in general I probably enjoyed this a little bit more than Gretchen did. Again, this is an author that I've already read something from and enjoyed previously. I also tend to read more novellas than Gretchen does, and some of her complaints, rightfully so, or that there wasn't enough space or enough time given to certain elements of the story, which I agree with. I do feel like there definitely could have been more character development. There definitely could have been more romance development in this. But at the end of the day, I enjoyed what was going on. There were a lot of little elements that I felt were done really well, and overall it's very well written. I understand the complaints, and we'll go in and talk about those in more detail here in the rest of the video. But for me, this was like at least a 4-star. I think I gave it 4.25 stars on Storygraph. I enjoyed it. There was a lot of elements that had to do with religion and sort of the mysticism and magic that is inherent in those. There was a lot of elements, especially with the LGBTQIA stuff that was going on in here, that was really nice as well. Just to see a trans character and a non-binary character get together, it's just nice to have adult romances with these characters there shown having happy endings, because I feel like they're few and far between at the moment. So yeah, if you're looking for just like a quick trans romance, definitely something to pick up and look at. If you like horror elements mixed in there, definitely something that you should look at, because there's some really spooky bits in here.
Listen, I know who I am, and I apologize for that. But there were basically a 3-strike list in this book, just of things that I, on a technical level, just don't normally jive with. The first was, as Michaela mentioned, it's a novella. I love romances because I get to watch a relationship develop, and in a novella, there's not a lot of time for that. There is the fact that it is single POV, so it is a romance from Colin's perspective, and the reason that it's single POV is for that 3rd strike, and we'll talk about this more, which is that in the beginning it very heavily leans on the withholding information trope, and so if we had Bishop's point of view, we would know the information that we're not supposed to know. So all of these things do not make this a bad book. Those are things that I just stylistically am not a huge fan of. So I knew it was a novella going into it. The other things revealed themselves as I was reading, and I was like, oh boy, it's gonna be fine, guys. I really did enjoy the book, though. I had to get over those elements, but as Michaela said, this book is fantastically written, And for being a novella, it is able to handle issues of religion, issues of diaspora and culture and race and just LGBTQIA. Like, all of that is in there in a really natural way that didn't feel like any of those things was hitting you over the head and taking up more room than it needed to, but also that they weren't getting short shrift. And again, just beautiful turns of phrase throughout. So for me, the writing style and the world building really lift this book up. I did rate it lower than Michaela. I gave it 3.5 on Storygraph, but like, that's not a bad book. I just admit to being who I am, and if you are not like me, you will probably enjoy it more.
I wanted to start on a high note when we're going to discuss this and talk specifically about the use of magic as pertains to religion in this novella. The fact that there are 3 different characters from 3 different backgrounds that are ostensibly tied to also 3 different religions who all have their own form of magic, including magic based on the Catholic Church. The way that Colin is able to do these exorcisms or cleanings, I believe is what he calls it, is by calling on angels. So like something that comes from like angels and saints, things that come from the Catholic faith, even though Colin himself is no longer tied to the Catholic faith. We have a brujo who their magic comes from sort of an Aztec belief. It had something to do with jaguars. That also obviously stems from a religion. And then we had a Norse pagan witch, and their magic obviously coming from the, like, a more traditional, like, Wicca sort of sense, but specifically of the Norse pagan branch and tied with their religion. All of these characters have a form of magic that they can use, and they're different, and it isn't overly explained. Like, this isn't necessarily a fantasy book. It is fantastic and speculative, as a lot of horror is. Like, the ghost element alone makes it speculative, but it wasn't like, I didn't feel like I was getting a lesson on a world building. Like, it was our world based on magic that comes from religions that you sort of have a little bit of knowledge about if you just are aware in the pop culture. It's one of those things where I personally find them really interesting, this way of saying, like, oh, the elements of these religions are true and have a mysticism about them, even if you don't necessarily believe in any one of them. Because there are characters here who have lost their faith and yet are still able to do the magic that is required of them based on that faith. It's very interesting. It's such an interesting theme. And if you find religion interesting at all, I would recommend Frady's work in general, because they focus at that. But like, that was just an element that I thought was done so very well. There was like this world building thing with the magic that was just beautiful and not overdone.
So while I absolutely agree with everything Michaela just said, we also did have a mild disagreement about one of the other elements of the book, which I brought up earlier. And so while there is a lot we could talk about with this book, we are going to tell you about that, because that is the magic of Betwixt the Books, is that betwixt both of our opinions, you get some interesting flavor. So anyway, earlier in my review, I mentioned the withholding trope. I think it also probably has a different name. I happen to use that word, but essentially what that means is that when Colin gets there, Bishop is like, hey, my house is haunted. And as Colin, realizes how bad the haunting is, how many hauntings are going on in the house, and the fact that the haunting seems specifically tied to Bishop, Colin is like, hey, I don't think you're telling me everything. And Bishop is not. Bishop is not, and you know that. And the thing is that, for me, that trope drives me up a wall. I don't like it. I can forgive it if it is resolved in a meaningful way. It has meaning to it. But when it's first introduced, I just immediately am like, eh. Especially when Colin is saying to Bishop, listen, I cannot help you if you do not tell me the truth. And so Michaela's going to talk a little bit more on, why this trope, this book, this thing. But if that is something that immediately raises your hackles, it's going to be there. And I'll be back for more of my opinion after Michaela.
When Gretchen voiced this complaint to me, I was like, I also usually have issue or take offense to when characters withhold information that's necessary to move forward. In this case, Bishop very much knows who is haunting the house and why they're haunting it, but isn't divulging that information for a very good reason, in my opinion. If they divulge that information to Colin, that information could be used to hurt them. And that's a completely understandable reason to not want to say, like, the things that need to be said to resolve the haunting. Now, I said that I felt like that was justified. Like, I understand not wanting to divulge that information. So even though Colin is saying, like, I realize I can't do anything about this until I know who is haunting the house and why they're haunting it. And they just don't divulge that information for, like, at least halfway through the book, I want to say. I also do understand, like, that can be frustrating because you, the reader, and Colin knows that, knows that that information is known. Like, he could tell that it's being withheld from him, and it isn't a matter of, like, oh, I don't actually know what's going on. It's just a matter of I'm not going to tell you specifically. I felt like, especially because both of these characters are trans, and the character that is withholding information is also a person of color, because Bishop is Mexican descent, and Colin is not. Colin is white. That there was an element of distrust that made sense for these characters. There is a, on Bishop's point, I don't even know if you're the real deal. Like, I don't know if you can do this magic, if you can even do this, so I need to, like, learn to be okay with you. There's the, like, I don't know, like, if you're gonna be cool with what's going on with me as a person because of the race thing. There's just a general distrust of outsiders when it comes to LGBTQ stuff. Like, even though both characters in this are trans in some way, there is just an element of, like, hiding yourself and putting a different face forward that makes sense for these characters. Like, I understood why it was there and it didn't bother me as much. I just wanted to say, like, if you take those things into account, it may not bother you either, but I do understand what Gretchen is saying when it comes to how it was resolved, which she's going to talk about next.
So I am not discounting anything Michaela just said. I totally get that. I understand it. I understood it when I read it. Well, after you finally realize what the information is and you're like, oh yeah, you know, you can't use that in an opening statement. But what I will say, the problem for me was the way that it's resolved, because there is a novella. For me, when the moment to trust Colin finally came, I was like, why? Why is this moment any different from the moment prior to this, except for that you, like, there just wasn't enough relationship building. Obviously they knew each other a little better, but, like, I personally didn't get that shift in the relationship. I didn't get that time they had spent together. You know, maybe Colin certainly hadn't offered up some stuff about himself that maybe he could have to help Bishop trust him a little bit more. So I was like, it just felt like a plot device. It just felt like a plot device. But I am also wired, as I said, to be way more critical of that if it is not resolved to my expectations. And really, once that is passed, there's a lot of really interesting stuff that happens in the book. It gets way more action-packed, way more horror elements. I can't tell you what they are because that would be a huge spoiler alert. But I will say that if you can get past that moment, which I don't know if I would have if Michaela and I weren't reading this together, because it bothers me so much. If you can get past it, the rest of it is better. You just have to stick it out. If you can.
That later section of the book is where a lot of those elements of religion, of magic, there's elements of race and some LGBTQ identity stuff. That's where a lot of that really happens towards the end of the book. And that's, I think, where this book's strengths are. There are some very well-written passages. I think there was one that Gretchen texted me when Colin confesses his feelings. That is, like, especially beautiful. Like, there's a lot of passages in here that are very, like, beautifully written. Like, I think Gretchen's way of phrasing it was that this author knows how to turn a phrase, which is, I think, very accurate. they're able to talk about all of these things in like very small snippets, with even in some cases one sentence, where they say, one character says something to somebody else, and you are able to see these sort of very large conversations that happen outside of the book sort of portrayed in a single moment, which I think is like incredibly talented. Obviously, this is a newer author. I think it says in the end notes of the book that this was the first book that they had ever written, at least to this large scale, and they have several books that have been published before this point, one of which being Exodus 23, which I read and really enjoyed. It's another novella-length romance. This one includes a biblically accurate angel and is a bit more spicy than Heart Hunt Havoc is. Heart Hunt Havoc was like remarkably clean in a lot of elements. There was some like bits and pieces of sexy things, but it was like kind of mushy and fluffy and written beautifully, but not like very dirty. Like I wouldn't go there for a spicy read. But that one was quite good, especially if you were like a monster romance person. This is an author that I personally would definitely read from again and would like to like see where they go. They have such interesting views on these things. And I'm always interested in the ways that religion is viewed from like a weirdly skeptical but accepting point of view. It's just an interesting book in general, and an author whose work I'm sure will focus on this more as we continue to read from them.
This was my first book by this author, but let me tell you, if they ever do a full-length novel, I will be 100% there for it. Maybe not another novella, just because I don't always think that that's fair to set myself up for that with that author. But again, like Michaela said, great turns of phrase, great just substance in this in a very short space. I wish there was more of it, and you know that's a complaint, but in terms of complaints, that's probably the best one there is. Anyway, we are using this for our buddy reading challenge, and if you haven't seen, every year we give ourselves reading challenges to read different types of books together for our Betwixt content, and we are counting this one for our romance with a queer lead category. Given our interests, it probably will not be the only one that we read, but you know. If you want to read this book yourself, I read it on Kindle Unlimited, where it is available, but it is also available in print from Amazon. So you can go out and get it that way. If you feel so inclined, check it out yourself, see what this magical secret is that we keep talking about. And you know what? Go read it, come back, and tell us whether you think the withholding information bit was really a problem or not, because, you know, this is Betwixt the Books, and we are here for friendly book discussion, even if it's a mild disagreement. Thanks for watching, guys. We will have more content coming soon, hopefully, probably. You know, PhDs are hard, and being an adult is difficult, but always great to talk about books with you guys. We'll see you then. Bye.